I've never been good at parties. When I'm in a room full of people I don't know well, making small talk, laughing at jokes, seeming engaged and interesting, I can do it. I've learned how, but the whole time there's this awareness that I'm performing, that the real me, the one who'd rather be at home, is somewhere underneath this social performance, waiting to escape. And I wonder sometimes if other people feel this way. If the confident, outgoing people at these gatherings are just better actors than I am, or if they actually feel the way they appear. If there's some authentic self they're expressing while I'm just pretending. But here's the unsettling question. What if there's no real me underneath the performance? What if the version of myself that shows up at parties, the one who makes conversation and laughs at jokes, is just as real as the one who wants to leave? What if I'm not hiding my true self by acting confident? What if acting confident is how sales get made? This sounds like a self-help idea. Fake it till you make it. Act confident and you'll become confident. But it's deeper and stranger than that, because it raises a question about what it means to be authentic at all. If you become what you do, if there's no fixed self underneath your behaviour, then what does it mean to be yourself? One thinker spent his life investigating this question, and what he discovered was interesting. You don't have a self that you express through action. You create a self by acting. And that means the question isn't whether you're being authentic when you act differently than you feel. The question is whether the feeling or the action comes first. William James was born in 1842 in New York City into a wealthy, intellectually restless family. His father was a theologian. His brother Henry would become one of America's greatest novelists. The family moved constantly between America and Europe, and young William seemed unable to settle on who he wanted to be. He wanted to be a painter, studied under a renowned portraitist for a year, then gave it up, convinced he lacked real talent. He enrolled at Harvard to study chemistry, then switched to comparative anatomy, then medicine. He was always trying on different identities, different versions of himself, searching for the one that would feel authentic, that would feel like him, but nothing stuck. After he graduated with his medical degree in 1869, the searching stopped, not because he found himself, but because he collapsed entirely. He moved back into his parents' home and spent nearly 3 years essentially unable to function. Back pain, digestive problems, vision trouble. But the physical symptoms seemed secondary to something else, a depression so severe that he contemplated suicide. The strange thing about this depression was how it felt, or rather how it didn't feel. It wasn't that he felt sad exactly, it was more that he couldn't feel anything in a way that seemed connected to who he was. He would go through the motions of daily life when he could manage it at all, but there was this sense that no version of himself was real. The depressed person lying in bed wasn't the real William James waiting to be rescued. There was no real William James. There were just these different states he moved through, none of them more authentic than the others. His medical training had given him a framework for understanding this. He'd been educated to see human beings as biological machines, arrangements of matter following physical laws. Every thought, every feeling, was just neurons firing in patterns determined by chemistry and circumstance, which meant there was no essential self underneath all that, no ghost in the machine, just the machine. But here's what made this unbearable. If there was no essential self, then what was he waiting for? He couldn't just wait to feel better before acting, because the feeling wouldn't come from some true self emerging. The feeling would just be another mechanical state his nervous system happened to produce. He was trapped in a particular state, depressed, paralyzed, unable to function, and no amount of waiting for his real self to appear was going to change that. While he was a medical student, James had visited an asylum. He saw patients whose conditions had reduced them to almost nothing, barely conscious, seemingly without personality or will. And he realised that could be him, not because he was fundamentally different from how he was now, but because there was no fundamental anything. just whatever state his nervous system happened to be producing at any given time, and right now it was producing paralysis. Then, in April 1870, he was reading an essay by a French philosopher named Charles Renouvier, and he came across a definition that seemed both simple and radical. Free will, Renouvier wrote, was the sustaining of a thought because I choose to when I might have other thoughts. That was it, not some essential self-choosing, not some ghost in a machine making decisions, just the observation that at any given moment multiple thoughts are available to consciousness and you can sustain one rather than another. You can't control which thoughts arise, but you can control which ones you keep attending to. James wrote in his diary, "I think that yesterday was a crisis in my life. I finished the first part of Renouvier's essay and see no reason why his definition of free will need to be the definition of an illusion. At any rate, I will assume for the present, until next year, that this is no illusion. My first act of free will shall be to believe in free will." But here's what happened next, and this is the part that mattered. He started acting differently. Not because he felt different first, not because some authentic, healthy version of himself had emerged. He started acting as if he believed in his own agency, and the acting produced a feeling. Slowly, incompletely, but it produced it. He would later develop this into a full theory, that emotion doesn't cause action, action causes emotion. You don't run because you're afraid because you run. You don't smile because you're happy because you smile. The bodily action comes first, and the feeling follows. Which means you don't wait to feel confident before acting confident. You act confident, and the acting creates whatever confidence is available to you. You don't wait to feel like the kind of person who gets out of bed before getting out of bed. You get out of bed, and the person who does this is who you are. This wasn't a complete cure for James. He struggled with depression and physical ailments for the rest of his life. But something fundamental had shifted. He discovered that he wasn't waiting to become his true self. He was creating a self through action. And the self he created, the professor, the psychologist, the writer, wasn't more or less authentic than the depressed person lying in bed. It was just a result of different actions, sustained over time. So what exactly did James discover? The answer is more radical than it might seem at first. He started with something observable, almost mechanical. He noticed that in many cases, the emotion you feel follows from the physical action you take, not the other way around. The common sense view is that you feel an emotion, and then your body responds to it. You see a shadow, you feel afraid, and then you run. You receive good news, you feel happy, and then you smile. The emotion causes the physical response. But James argued this was backwards. You see a shadow, you run, and then you feel afraid. You receive good news, your face breaks into a smile, and then you feel happy. The physical action comes first. The feeling is your mind's interpretation of what your body is already doing. This sounds strange, but he had evidence for it. He pointed out that if you strip away all the bodily responses to an emotion, the racing heart, the tense muscles, the facial expression, there's nothing left to feel. Try to imagine fear without any physical sensation. No elevated heartbeat, no shallow breathing, no muscular tension. What remains? The word fear maybe, but not the feeling, because the feeling is the sensation of your body in that particular state. Which means the emotion isn't something separate from the physical response that causes it. The emotion is the experience of the physical response. You're not crying because you're sad. You're sad because you're crying. Now, this might seem like a technical point about how emotions work, but James understood it had much wider implications, because if feeling follows action rather than causing it, then you don't need to wait to feel like a certain kind of person before acting like that person. You act and the feeling follows, or at least whatever feeling is available follows. Think about what that means. If you want to feel confident, you don't need to somehow generate a feeling of confidence first and then act on it. You act confident. You stand up straight. you speak clearly, you make eye contact, and your mind interprets these physical behaviours and produces whatever version of confidence is accessible to you. The acting isn't pretending to be confident until you really are. The acting is what being confident consists of. Or take something like being happy. The conventional view is that happiness is something you feel first and then you express it. You're happy, so you smile. But James's view suggests this is backwards. You smile, and that physical action creates the feeling of happiness. You don't wait to feel happy before acting happy. You act happy. You smile. You laugh. You move your body in ways that happy people move. And the repeated performance of these actions creates the neural patterns, the emotional state, the experience we call happiness. Is it that simple? No, but James's insight still holds for the ordinary emotional states most people experience. The feeling often follows the action, even when it doesn't arrive fully formed or permanently. You're not waiting for happiness to descend before you act. You're creating whatever version of happiness is accessible, however imperfect, through the action itself. This is where his work on habit becomes important, because James argued that habits aren't just about efficiency or routine. Habits are how character gets formed. Every time you perform an action, you're carving a pathway in your nervous system. Do it enough times and the pathway becomes automatic. The action becomes easier, more natural. Eventually it becomes part of who you are. But here's the philosophically interesting part. If character is formed through habit, and habit is formed through repeated action, then there's no essential self underneath waiting to be discovered. There's just the accumulation of actions over time, creating patterns, creating what we call personality or character. This is radically different from the idea that you have a true self and the goal is to find it and express it authentically. James is suggesting that there's no true self to find. There are just different possible selves you can create through different patterns of action. The person who goes to parties and makes conversation isn't being inauthentic by performing sociability. That person is just as real as the one who wants to stay at home. They're both versions of you that exist depending on what you do. This might sound like the familiar advice to fake it till you make it, but James's insight is actually more radical than that. Fake it till you make it assume there's a real you underneath, someone who is genuinely confident or brave or skilled, and you're just pretending until that authentic person emerges. It treats the acting as temporary, a means to an end. You fake confidence until you become confident, and then you can stop faking. But James is saying something different. There's no authentic person waiting underneath. The acting isn't a temporary strategy until you become confident. The acting is what being confident consists of. You don't eventually make it and get to stop performing. You just keep acting, and that ongoing pattern of action is what selfhood is. The performance isn't fake, it's the only real thing there is. You are what you repeatedly do, and there's no separate, more authentic self hiding beneath the doing. And this raises an interesting question. If there's no authentic self underneath your behaviour, how do you decide which self to create? Because you can't appeal to being true to yourself when there's no fixed self to be true to. You have to make a choice about what kind of person to become through your actions, but you can't make that choice based on who you really are, because who you really are is still being created by the choice. James's answer was pragmatic. You judge by consequences. You don't ask, which action expresses my true self? You ask, which pattern of action creates a self I can live with? Which habits, performed consistently, produce a version of me that functions in the world? And this is why his philosophy was called pragmatism. The truth isn't found in correspondence to some deeper reality. The truth is found in what works. If acting confident makes you more functional than waiting to feel confident, then acting confident is true for you. Not because confidence is your authentic nature, but because the acting creates a reality where confidence exists. But James was honest about how this works, because if you are what you do, if there's no fixed self underneath, then you're responsible for creating yourself through every action. You can't fall back on, this is just who I am, as an excuse. The person you are right now is the result of actions you've taken or failed to take, and the person you'll be in the future depends on what you choose to do today. This is liberating and demanding in equal measure. Liberating because it means you're not stuck with some essential nature. You're not doomed to be anxious or timid or unskilled because that's your true self. You can act differently, and the acting can create a different self. But it's also demanding because it means there's no destination. You don't arrive at your authentic self and then just be that person. You're constantly creating yourself through action, and if you stop acting, the self you've built starts to erode. James saw this in his own life. During his crisis, he was one kind of person, depressed, paralyzed, unable to function. But that wasn't his true self waiting for rescue. It was just a self being created by inaction. When he started acting differently, getting out of bed, working, engaging with the world, a different self emerged, not because the real William James finally appeared, but because different actions create a different person. And for the rest of his life, he had to keep acting. He couldn't stop and rest in some achieved authentic identity, because the moment he stopped acting like the functional, productive version of himself, that self started to disappear. The acting had to be ongoing. This is what acting as if really means in James's philosophy. It's not a temporary strategy until you become the thing you're pretending to be. It's the recognition that the pretending is what being consists of. You don't act confident until you become confident. You act confident, and the acting is what confidence is. So what does this mean for that feeling at parties? The sense that I'm performing, that the real me is somewhere else? Through James's lens, the question dissolves, because there is no real me underneath the performance. The version of myself making conversation and laughing at jokes is just as real as the version of me who wants to be at home. Neither one is more authentic. They're both patterns of behaviour that create different versions of who I am. The discomfort comes from thinking one version is pretending and the other one is genuine. But if identity is created through action, then both are genuine. When I'm at home, I'm creating the person who prefers solitude. When I'm at a party making conversation, I'm creating the person who can be social and engaged. Neither action is expressing some fixed self. Both actions are creating a self. And this is where the philosophy becomes practical, though not in a self-help way, because it changes the question. The question isn't, how do I be my authentic self at this party? The question is, which self do I want to create through my actions right now? If I spend the next year avoiding parties, staying home, prioritising solitude, I'll create a self for whom social situations feel increasingly foreign and difficult. Not because that's my true nature revealing itself, but because those actions, the pattern of withdrawal and avoidance, creates that particular version of me. The habit of solitude builds a person who needs solitude. But if I keep going to parties, keep making conversation even when it feels like a performance, I'm creating a different self, one for whom social engagement is part of the repertoire, not because I've discovered some hidden, extroverted nature, but because the repeated action builds the pathway. The habit of showing up creates a person who can show up. Neither choice is right or wrong in some absolute sense, but both choices have consequences for who I become. And I can't escape the choice by appealing to authenticity, because there's no fixed authentic self to appeal to. This is what James meant when he wrote that his first act of free will was to believe in free will. He wasn't discovering his true nature as someone with agency. He was creating a version of himself who acted as if agency existed. And that pattern of action built the person who could function. The alternative, continuing to act as if he had no free will, was creating a different person, one who couldn't get out of bed. The same mechanism applies to smaller things. If you want to be the kind of person who calls their mother regularly, You don't wait until you feel like that person and then make the cause. You make the cause, and the pattern of making then creates the person who does that. The feeling of being a good son or daughter follows from the action, not the other way around. Or if you want to be happy, you don't wait until you feel happy and then smile. You smile, you engage with people, you move through the world in ways that happy people move, and the repeated action creates the neural pathways, the emotional patterns, the lived experience of happiness. The happiness isn't there first, waiting to be expressed. It's created through the expression. But here's what makes this hard. You're responsible for the creation. You can't say, I'm just not a social person, or I'm not naturally artistic, as if these are fixed facts about your essential nature. Because according to James, there is no essential nature. There's just the person you've created through your past actions and the person you're creating through your current ones. If you're not happy, James argues it's because you've not performed enough actions that create happiness. If you're anxious in social situations, it's because you haven't created the habits that would make you feel less anxious. And you could create different patterns through different actions, but that would require acting before you feel like it, sustaining actions that don't yet feel natural, building a self that doesn't yet exist. This is why James's philosophy doesn't feel reassuring in the way self-help usually does. Self-help says, you're wonderful, just be yourself. James says there is no self to be. You're creating a self through every action, and you're responsible for what you create. There's something liberating about this view of identity. The conventional wisdom tells us that we have a fixed nature. We're just not social people, or not creative types, or bad at commitment, as if these are immutable facts about who we essentially are. And that's the real trap, because if you believe your identity is fixed, you're stuck with it. But James is offering something far more hopeful. You're not fated to be anything. There's no predetermined self you're stuck with. The person you are right now is just the accumulated result of actions you've taken in the past. And the person you'll be in the future depends on what you choose to do today. If you're anxious in social situations, that's not your essential nature revealing itself. It's a pattern created by past avoidance, by the habit of withdrawal. And patterns can be changed through different actions. You're not doomed to feel that way forever. You can create a different version of yourself through different choices sustained over time. This is ennobling in a way that be yourself never is, because be yourself assumes there's a fixed self to be, and if that self happens to be anxious or timid or disorganized, you're stuck with it. But James is saying you make yourself through your actions, which means you have the power to make something different. The responsibility is real. You can't blame your essential nature for your failures. You can't just say, that's who I am, as an excuse for not changing. But that responsibility comes with possibility. Every action is a chance to create the person you want to be, not discover them, create them. I don't know if I feel differently at the next party I attend, but I know what I'm doing there is different now. I'm not trying to express some authentic social self or failing to be my true introverted self. I'm creating a version of myself through the action of showing up. The person who goes to parties and makes conversation is just as real as the person who wants to stay at home. And which one I become depends on what I repeatedly do. This is what James discovered in 1870 when he chose to believe in his own agency. He wasn't finding his true self. He was creating a self through action. And that self, built through the daily choice to get out of bed, to work, to engage, was real precisely because he made it through his actions. You aren't born as yourself. You become yourself through what you do. And that means the person you are isn't fixed. It's being created right now through the choices you make. That's not unsettling. That's real freedom.